£50,000. That was the price of a human life on a damp Tuesday in 1814. They didn't call it a sale, of course. They called it a settlement, a marriage of convenience. But when 20-year-old Nora watched her aunt pocket the bank draft with trembling, greedy fingers, she knew exactly what she was. Property. Bound for the estate of a reclusive duke rumored to be a monster, she expected a prison. What she found instead defied everything. The drawing room of number 4 Chelsea Square smelled of stale lavender and impending ruin. Nora sat perfectly still on the edge of a horsehair sofa that scratched through the thin cotton of her faded dress. Across from her, Aunt Harriet paced. The older woman's silk skirts rustled like dry leaves, a sound Nora had long associated with displeasure. But today, the rustling was frantic, punctuated by the sharp clicks of Harriet's heels against the hardwood floor. "Read it again, Mr. Finch," Harriet demanded, stopping abruptly in front of the small, balding man seated at the writing desk. The exact phrasing. Mr. Finch cleared his throat, adjusting his spectacles. He looked thoroughly miserable. In exchange for the immediate settlement of all outstanding debts belonging to the estate of the late Mr. Thomas Croft, totaling £42,000, and an additional stipend of £8,000 to be paid directly to Mrs. Harriet Croft. He paused, his eyes flicking nervously toward Nora before dropping back to the heavy parchment. Miss Eleanor Linfield shall travel to Oakhaven to be wed by special license to Arthur Pendleton, Duke of Wrotham. A profound silence settled over the room. Outside, the London rain beat a steady, indifferent rhythm against the window panes. Nora didn't cry. There was no point. Tears were a luxury afforded to women who had someone left in the world to comfort them. Since her father's death 5 years ago, she had been a dependent in her aunt's house, an unpaid governess, a seamstress, a convenient scapegoat for every burnt roast and unpaid butcher's bill. She had long understood that her existence was a line item in her aunt's ledger. Today, that ledger was finally being balanced. £50,000! Harriet breathed, her eyes gleaming with a manic, triumphant light. She turned to Nora, offering a smile that didn't reach her cold, pale eyes. "You see, Nora, I always said I would do right by you. A duchess. You are to be a duchess. You should be on your knees thanking me." "I am being sold, Aunt," Nora said. Her voice was quiet, lacking malice but completely devoid of warmth. "Let us not dress it up in lace." Harriet's smile snapped shut. "You ungrateful little wretch. Do you know what Wrotham's solicitors threatened? Debtor's prison? The Fleet? I would have died in the damp, and you would have been cast out into the streets to sell apples, or worse. The Duke requires a wife, a quiet, unobtrusive wife of gentle birth with no surviving immediate family to interfere. You fit the bill. Sign the paper." Nora looked at the heavy gold signet ring resting on the desk beside the inkwell. It bore the crest of the Duke of Wrotham. She knew the rumours. Everyone in London knew the rumours. Arthur Pendleton had not been seen in polite society for half a decade. Before that, he had been a fixture of the House of Lords, brilliant, ruthless, and famously intolerant of fools. Then came the fire at his country estate. The newspapers had been vague, but the whispers in the drawing rooms were visceral. They said he was horribly disfigured. They said he had gone mad, locking himself away in the darkest wing of Oakhaven. Some even whispered that he had started the fire himself in a fit of rage. And now he was buying a wife. "Does he require my signature, Mr. Finch?" Nora asked, her gaze fixed on the solicitor. Finch swallowed hard. "Strictly speaking, miss, no. Your aunt is your legal guardian, but His Grace expressed a desire that you be made fully aware of the terms before your departure." "How very democratic of a monster," Nora thought cynically. She stood up. The worn fabric of her skirts settled around her battered boots. She walked to the desk, took the quill from Mr. Finch's trembling hand, and signed her name in bold, unflinching strokes beneath her aunt's erratic scrawl. "When do I leave?" she asked. "The carriage is waiting outside, Miss Linfield," Finch said softly. "His Grace is not a man who favours delays." Nora nodded. She didn't look at her aunt. She didn't say goodbye. She walked up the narrow, creaking stairs to her attic room, packed her 3 remaining dresses, a worn copy of Shakespeare her father had given her, and a small wooden music box into a battered valise. Within 20 minutes, she was seated in the dark, velvet-lined interior of the Duke's carriage. As it lurched forward, its iron-shod wheels crushing the cobblestones, Nora watched her aunt's townhouse disappear into the fog. She felt hollow. There was no fear, only a cold, hard certainty. She had survived Aunt Harriet by becoming invisible. She would survive the Duke of Rotham exactly the same way. The journey north took 3 days. It rained for 2 of them. Mr. Finch rode inside the carriage with her, though he spent most of the time either pretending to read a thick legal tome or sleeping with his chin resting on his chest. Nora preferred his silence. It gave her time to study the changing landscape. As they left the suffocating sprawl of London, the neat hedgerows and manicured fields slowly gave way to something wilder. The sky bruised into deep purples and greys. By the 3rd afternoon, they were traversing the moors of Yorkshire. The land here was stripped bare, battered by wind and punctuated by jagged outcroppings of dark stone. It felt like the edge of the world. "We are nearly there, miss," Finch mumbled, jolting awake as the carriage hit a particularly deep rut. He rubbed his eyes, looking at her with a mixture of pity and guilt. "Tell me about him," Nora said suddenly. It was the first time she had spoken in miles. Finch stiffened. "His Grace." "No, the carriage driver." "Yes, Mr. Finch, His Grace. I am to marry the man tomorrow. I would prefer to know if I should expect him to eat the silver or throw the china at my head." A small, surprised laugh escaped the solicitor before he caught himself. He is not a madman, Miss Linfield, despite what the gossips at Elmax might say. He is simply a man who has suffered deeply. The fire—" Finch hesitated, choosing his words with agonizing care. "It took a great toll on him. Physically, he does not suffer society well. He requires quiet, order. He expects obedience, certainly, but he is not a cruel man by nature." "Cruelty takes many forms, Mr. Finch," Nora replied, staring out the window at the bleak landscape. "Neglect is merely cruelty dressed in indifference." Finch had no answer to that. An hour later, the carriage turned off the main road and passed through a set of towering wrought-iron gates. They drove for another 2 miles through a dense, ancient forest where the trees grew so close together their branches formed a suffocating canopy, blocking out the fading afternoon light. Then the trees broke, and Oakhaven rose before them. Nora had expected a crumbling, Gothic monstrosity, draped in ivy and shadows. Instead, Oakhaven was a masterpiece of Palladian architecture. It was massive, perfectly symmetrical, and constructed of pale stone that seemed to glow against the dark moorland sky. Yet, despite its beauty, it was chilling. There were hundreds of windows, but not a single one showed a flicker of candlelight. The house looked blind. It looked dead. The carriage rolled to a halt before a grand sweep of stone stairs. The heavy front doors opened immediately. Nora stepped out into the biting wind, clutching her thin shawl around her shoulders. A woman stood at the top of the stairs, flanked by 2 footmen in austere black livery. She was tall, rail-thin, and dressed in severe grey bombazine. A ring of heavy iron keys hung at her waist. "Miss Linfield?" the woman said. Her voice was brisk, carrying effortlessly over the wind. "I am Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper. Welcome to Oakhaven." "Thank you," Nora said. She didn't wait for the footman. She picked up her own battered valise. Mrs. Gable's eyes flicked to the scuffed leather bag, then to Nora's cheap coat, but her expression remained completely impassive. "Allow the staff to take that, miss. Follow me. You must be exhausted." The interior of Oakhaven was staggering in its wealth, but oppressive in its silence. The marble floors gleamed. The tapestries on the walls were rich and vibrant, yet the air was cold, smelling faintly of beeswax and old wood. There was no chatter from the servants, no clinking of dishes from distant kitchens. Every footstep echoed like a gunshot. Mrs. Gable led her up a grand, sweeping staircase and down a long corridor lined with closed doors. Finally she stopped, opening a door to reveal a sprawling bedchamber. It was exquisite. A massive four-poster bed was draped in heavy crimson velvet. A fire roared in the marble hearth, casting a warm, golden glow over the Persian rugs and mahogany furniture. On the bed lay a nightgown of impossibly fine silk, and beside it, a velvet box containing a diamond necklace that likely cost more than Aunt Harriet's entire townhouse. Nora stared at the opulence, a heavy knot forming in her stomach. A gilded cage was still a cage. The sheer extravagance of it all felt like a threat, a reminder of exactly how much she had been bought for. "Your bath is being drawn in the adjoining room," Mrs. Gable said smoothly. "His Grace requests your presence in the dining room at precisely 8 o'clock. Nora turned to the housekeeper. "Will he be joining me?" "Yes, miss. It will be just the two of you." Mrs. Gable paused in the doorway, her sharp eyes softening by a fraction of an inch. "Do not stare at his hands, Miss Linfield. If you take one piece of advice from me tonight, let it be that." With that, the heavy oak door clicked shut, leaving Nora entirely alone. By 5 minutes to 8, Nora was standing outside the double doors of the formal dining room. She wore her best dress, a dark navy wool that was woefully out of fashion and visibly mended at the cuffs. She had braided her dark hair tightly, pinning it to the nape of her neck. She looked like a governess reporting to be reprimanded, not a bride on the eve of her wedding. But Nora refused to wear the diamonds, and she refused to wear the silk. She would not play the part of the grateful, pretty purchase. The tall case clock in the hallway chimed the hour. On the final stroke, the footman opened the doors. The dining room was cavernous. A mahogany table stretched for what looked like 30 feet down the center of the room, illuminated by a massive crystal chandelier. At the far end of the table sat a man in shadows, his back to the roaring fireplace. Nora walked the length of the room. Her sensible boots made dull thuds against the carpet. She kept her chin parallel to the floor, her heart beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs, though she forced her face into a mask of polite indifference. As she drew closer, the shadows retreated, and the Duke of Wrotham came into focus. He did not look like a monster. He looked like a man who had been slowly, methodically broken. Arthur Pendleton was dressed in impeccably tailored, severe black broadcloth. His shoulders were broad, but he sat slumped in his chair, leaning heavily on a thick ebony cane propped against the table. His face was striking, sharp cheekbones, a strong jaw, and thick, dark hair touched with silver at the temples. But the left side of his face bore the undeniable marks of ruin. The skin from his jawline down to his collar was pale, tight, and violently scarred, a web of melted tissue that pulled his collar slightly askew. Nora remembered Mrs. Gable's warning. She forced her eyes up to meet his. His eyes were the color of slate, and they were piercing. They held none of the madness the gossips claimed, only a vast, chilling exhaustion. He watched her approach with the detached calculation of a predator assessing a very small, very dull bird. "Miss Linfield," he said. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone, raspy as though he rarely used it. He made a slight movement to rise. "Please, do not stand on my account, Your Grace," Nora said quickly, taking the chair to his immediate right. The vast expanse of the table lay empty beyond them. Arthur settled back into his chair, his grip tightening on the head of his cane. Slowly, he lifted his left hand to reach for his wine glass. Nora caught the movement before she could stop herself. The back of his hand was a mass of burn scars, the skin shiny and puckered, two of the fingers permanently curled inward. She jerked her eyes back to his face. The Duke caught the flinch. A bitter, humorless smile touched the unscarred corner of his mouth. "You may look, Miss Linfield. I assure you it will not turn you to stone." Nora felt a flush of heat rise to her cheeks. "I apologize. I did not mean to stare. Everyone stares, or they actively pretend they aren't staring, which is infinitely more exhausting," he murmured, taking a sip of his wine. He set the glass down and studied her. He took in her severe hair, her mended dress, and the defiant jut of her chin. "You are not what I expected. I imagine for £50,000 you expected silk and simpering, Your Grace." Nora replied, the cynical edge of her tongue slipping free before she could bite it back. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush bone. Nora froze. She had gone too far. She was in a secluded manor, hundreds of miles from anywhere, wholly at the mercy of a man who owned her on paper. Aunt Harriet would have struck her across the face for such insolence. Arthur stared at her. Then, incredibly, the tight, furious lines around his eyes relaxed. He let out a breath that sounded suspiciously like a laugh. "I have had quite enough of simpering in my lifetime," he said dryly. At that moment, the footman entered, carrying heavy silver trays. They placed a steaming bowl of clear broth in front of Nora, then moved to the Duke. They worked in utter silence, an orchestrated ballet of servitude that made Nora's skin crawl. When they stepped back, Arthur picked up his spoon. But Nora didn't move. The chill of the draughty house had finally seeped into her bones. Her fingers were trembling slightly in her lap, rigid with cold and the sheer, overwhelming tension of the last 3 days. Arthur noticed. He paused, his slate eyes dropping to her white-knuckled grip on her napkin, then shifting to the cold, dark hearth behind her chair. He didn't bark an order. He didn't command her to eat. Instead, he dropped his spoon, grasped his cane, and pushed himself up from the table. The movement was clearly agonizing. He leaned heavily on his right leg, his jaw tight. "Your Grace?" Nora asked, alarmed, halfway out of her chair. "Sit down, Miss Linfield," he commanded softly. He limped slowly around the table, his dragging step echoing in the cavernous room. He walked past her, ignoring the footman who watched him with wide, anxious eyes, and moved to the massive sideboard. He picked up a heavy silver tureen of thick, dark stew that hadn't yet been served. Carrying it awkwardly with his one good hand, he walked back to her side of the table and set it down in front of her. Then he looked at the 2 footmen. "Leave us," he said. "But, Your Grace, the second course," the braver of the 2 began. "Leave us," Arthur repeated, his voice barely a whisper, yet carrying the undeniable weight of absolute authority. The footmen bowed and vanished, closing the heavy doors behind them with a muffled click. Arthur stood beside Nora's chair for a moment. He reached out with his scarred left hand, his movements stiff but precise, and pushed the bowl of thin broth away. He dragged the heavy tureen of stew closer to her. "Eat," he said quietly. "It is hot. You are freezing, and you look as though a stiff wind might break you in 2. Nora looked up at him, entirely bewildered. You dismissed the servants." "I did," Arthur limped back to his seat and collapsed into it with a suppressed groan. He rubbed his thigh, staring into his wine glass. You are terrified. You are cold. And you are exhausting yourself trying to pretend you are, neither because you believe I require a performance. He looked up, his gaze locking with hers. The intensity in his eyes was stripped of all pretense. Listen to me very carefully, Miss Linfield, the Duke said, his voice dropping into a register of raw, grounding honesty. You were bought to balance a ledger. You are here because I require an heir, and society requires I have a wife to produce one. That is the ugly, cynical truth of it. He leaned forward slightly, the firelight catching the severe angles of his face. But you are not required to bleed for my entertainment. You are not required to pretend I am not a cripple, and you are not required to smile when you are terrified. Eat your dinner, Nora. You are safe here. Nora stared at the steaming food. The tightness in her chest, a knot she had carried since the moment she signed that contract in Aunt Harriet's parlour, suddenly, inexplicably, began to loosen. She picked up her spoon. She had expected a monster. She had braced herself for a tyrant. But as she took her first bite in the quiet warmth of the dining room, Nora realized something far more dangerous. The Duke of Rotham was human. The chapel at Oakhaven had not been used in a decade. It smelled intensely of damp stone, ancient dust, and the sharp, acidic tang of polishing wax applied too hastily by panicked servants. Nora stood before the altar at 10 o'clock the next morning. She wore a slate-grey travelling gown. It was the best garment she owned, though the hem was frayed and the bodice slightly too tight across her ribs. She refused to wear the bridal whites Aunt Harriet had packed. White was for beginnings. This was a transaction. Arthur stood beside her. He wore the same severe black broadcloth as the night before, his posture rigid. He leaned his weight entirely onto his cane, his jaw clenched tight against the pain of standing still for so long. The local vicar, a nervous man named Mr. Higgins, who looked entirely terrified of the Duke, rushed through the liturgy with the speed of a man fleeing a burning building. Do you, Arthur Pendleton, take this woman? Arthur stared straight ahead at the crumbling stone cross. I do. His voice was flat, devoid of any inflection. And do you, Eleanor Linfield? Nora looked at the stained glass window above the altar. It depicted a saint being martyred, arrows piercing his chest. A fitting backdrop, she thought wryly. I do. There was no hesitation, no dramatic pause. Arthur reached into his waistcoat pocket and produced a ring. He did not look at her face as he reached for her left hand. His scarred fingers brushed against her knuckles. His skin was unnaturally warm, a sharp contrast to the freezing chapel air. He slid a heavy gold band onto her finger. It was an antique, thick and unadorned. It fit perfectly. I pronounce you man and wife. Mr. Higgins squeaked, snapping his prayer book shut. Whom God hath joined, let no man put asunder. There was no kiss. Arthur simply dropped her hand and stepped back. He looked exhausted. The deep lines framing his mouth were carved sharply in the morning light, filtering through the dust motes. Mr. Finch has the remaining paperwork in the library, Arthur said, addressing the vicar rather than his new bride. See to it that he receives your signature before you leave. He turned to Nora. His slate eyes swept over her grey dress, lingering for a fraction of a second on the defiant set of her jaw. Mrs. Gable will show you to your permanent quarters, he told her. They are in the east wing. I reside in the west. The servants have been instructed to provide you with whatever you require. A carriage is at your disposal should you wish to tour the surrounding villages. I ask only that you do not enter the ruined section of the south wing. It is structurally unsound. It was a dismissal. Clear, concise, and utterly devoid of warmth. Am I to understand, Your Grace, that we will live entirely separate lives?" Nora asked. Her voice echoed slightly in the empty chapel. Arthur paused at the end of the aisle. He leaned heavily on his cane, slowly turning his head to look back at her. "You have your title, Nora. You have your security. I have fulfilled my obligation to society by taking a wife. There is no need for us to pretend this is anything other than what it is." "And the air you mentioned last night?" she asked quietly. A muscle ticked in his jaw. "In time, when you are less terrified of me." Before she could respond, he turned and limped out of the chapel, his cane striking the stone floor in a rhythm that sounded like a ticking clock fading into the distance. Nora stood alone at the altar. She looked down at the heavy gold ring on her finger. She was the Duchess of Rotham. She had £50,000 attached to her name, a sprawling estate at her command, and a husband who wanted nothing to do with her. For the first time in 5 years, nobody was demanding anything of her. She was not required to mend torn stockings, placate a furious aunt, or scrub soot from the hearth. The sheer weightlessness of it was terrifying. Mrs. Gable appeared silently at the chapel door, her keys jingling. "If you will follow me, Your Grace." Hearing the title directed at her sent a strange shiver down Nora's spine. She squared her shoulders. "Lead the way, Mrs. Gable." 3 days passed in absolute silence. Nora's rooms in the East Wing were breathtaking. She had a private sitting room bathed in morning light, a bedchamber with a mattress so soft it felt like sleeping on water, and a wardrobe slowly filling with exquisite gowns ordered by the Duke's tailor. She hated it. Idleness, she quickly discovered, was a slow poison. By the morning of the 4th day, Nora felt she was losing her mind. She paced the length of her sitting room, watching the rain lash against the mullioned windows. She felt like a very expensive ghost haunting a very beautiful tomb. She left her rooms and went in search of the housekeeper. She found Mrs. Gable in the lower kitchens, overseeing the delivery of root vegetables. "Mrs. Gable?" Nora said, stepping over a stray sack of potatoes. The housekeeper jumped, her severe expression faltering for a moment before she dropped into a crisp curtsy. "Your Grace, you should not be down here. The floors are damp." "I have survived damp floors before," Nora said reasonably. "I require a task." Mrs. Gable blinked. "A task, Your Grace. A duty, a responsibility. I am the mistress of this house, am I not?" "Technically, yes." Mrs. Gable looked deeply uncomfortable. "But His Grace handles the running of the estate. You are meant to—" "Relax?" Nora crossed her arms. "I do not know how to relax. I know how to work. Bring me the household ledgers, the butcher's accounts, the pantry inventories, the linens, all of it. Bring them to the morning room." An hour later, Nora sat behind a small rosewood desk, a mountain of leather-bound books piled before her. She cracked the first one open with a sense of grim satisfaction. Finally, a battleground she understood. Numbers did not lie. Numbers did not hide in the West Wing and refused to speak to her. She spent the next 6 hours dissecting the household accounts. She fully expected to find chaos. A reclusive, embittered duke who hid from the world surely let his estate fall to ruin, leaving the staff to steal him blind. What she found instead stopped her cold. She traced a finger down the column of wages. The footmen were paid twice the standard London rate. She turned the page to the tenant accounts. The rents were shockingly low, and there were dozens of annotations in Arthur's sharp, slashing handwriting. Rent forgiven. Widow with 4 children. Roof repair paid by estate. Do not charge tenant. Medical pension granted to Thomas Miller, crushed hand in the mill. Nora stared at the pages. Aunt Harriet would have evicted the widow, ignored the roof, and fired the miller without a reference. She closed the ledger and stood up. The rain had stopped, leaving a heavy grey mist hanging over the moors. She needed to understand the man who wrote these margins. She found Arthur in his study, a massive, dark, panelled room smelling of old paper, leather, and wood smoke. He was sitting behind a gargantuan oak desk, staring out the window. A half-empty glass of amber liquid sat near his elbow. He didn't turn when she entered. "I told Mrs. Gable I was not to be disturbed." "I am not Mrs. Gable," Nora said, closing the door behind her with a definitive click. Arthur turned his head slowly. He looked utterly drained. The dark circles under his eyes were prominent, and he hadn't shaved, the dark stubble contrasting sharply against the pale, shiny skin of his scars. "To what I owe the pleasure, madam?" he asked, his tone dripping with practiced weariness. Nora walked over to his desk and dropped the heavy household ledger directly onto the center of his blotter. It landed with a loud, dusty thud. Arthur blinked, looking from the book to her face. "What is this?" "This," Nora said, tapping the leather cover, "is the ledger containing your tenant accounts and staff wages. I spent the afternoon reviewing them." Arthur's posture stiffened. His good hand curled into a fist. "Those are my private accounts. Who gave you the authority to—" "I am your wife," Nora interrupted smoothly. "I require no authority to look at the household books. What I require is an explanation." Arthur's jaw tightened. "An explanation for what? Has someone been stealing?" "No, quite the opposite." Nora leaned over the desk. "You are running a charity, Your Grace. You forgave nearly half the winter rents. You are paying a pension to a boy who hasn't worked in the stables for 3 years because he was kicked by a horse. By all accounts of high society, you are a monster who cares for nothing but his own misery. Yet this ledger tells a very different story." Arthur stared at her. For a long moment, the study was dead silent, save for the crackle of the fire in the grate. Then he looked away, breaking her gaze. He reached for his glass, taking a slow sip. "The estate is profitable enough. The money does them more good than it does me. I have no use for it sitting in a vault." "It doesn't fit the narrative you've built," Nora pressed gently. "The terrifying beast of Oakhaven." "Perhaps," Arthur said softly, setting the glass down. "It is easier to let people believe you are a monster than to constantly prove you are still a man." He looked back at her, his slate eyes entirely stripped of their usual defensive anger. There was only a profound, echoing loneliness. "Why did you read them, Nora?" he asked. "Because I wanted to know who I married," she answered honestly. "I spent my life being managed by a woman who viewed me only as an asset to be leveraged. I wanted to see how you viewed the people under your care." Arthur studied her face, taking in the fierce intelligence in her eyes, the complete lack of fear in her posture. A very small, genuine smile touched his lips. It transformed his face, softening the harsh lines of his scars. "And what is your conclusion?" he murmured. Nora stood up straight. "That you are a terrible businessman, Your Grace, but you might be a decent man." For the first time since she had arrived at Oakhaven, Arthur Pendleton laughed. It was a rusty, broken sound, but it filled the dark study with something that felt dangerously like hope. The truce, if it could be called that, lasted precisely 2 weeks. Autumn bled into early winter, turning the Yorkshire moors a brittle, freezing brown. The days grew short. Inside Oakhaven, Nora and Arthur developed a tentative rhythm. They took their dinners together. The oppressive silence of the cavernous dining room slowly gave way to quiet, observational conversations. They discussed the estate, the weather, and the books Nora was devouring from the vast library. Arthur never spoke of London. He never spoke of his past. And he never, under any circumstances, spoke of the fire. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the fragile peace shattered. Nora had gone walking. She hated being cooped up, and a rare, pale sun had broken through the clouds. She bundled herself in a heavy wool cloak and wandered the vast, overgrown gardens behind the manor. Without realizing it, she strayed too far to the west. She pushed through a thick tangle of dead climbing roses and suddenly found herself standing before the south wing. Arthur had warned her away from it on their wedding day, and now she understood why. It was a graveyard of blackened stone and shattered glass. The roof had completely collapsed inward, leaving the massive structural beams exposed to the sky like the ribs of a rotting leviathan. What had once been a grand conservatory was now a twisted nightmare of melted iron frames and scorched earth. The smell of old ash still clung to the air, bitter and cold. Nora stepped closer, mesmerized by the devastation. The sheer scale of the fire must have been apocalyptic. She walked up to the edge of the ruin, her boots crunching on broken glass. She reached out, running a gloved hand over a piece of melted iron that had once been a door frame. "I told you never to come here." The voice cracked like a whip across the freezing air. Nora gasped, spinning around. Arthur stood 20 yards away. He had no cloak, only his shirt sleeves and a dark waistcoat, seemingly impervious to the biting cold. He was gripping his cane so tightly his knuckles were dead white. His chest heaved and his slate eyes were wide, blown dark with a terror so raw it made Nora physically recoil. "Arthur, I didn't mean to—" "Get away from there!" he roared. It was not the authoritative command of a duke. It was the panicked shout of a man watching someone step off a cliff. He didn't wait for her to move. He lunged forward. His bad leg gave way almost immediately on the uneven, frozen ground. He stumbled, his cane slipping on a patch of dead grass, and he went down hard, hitting the frozen earth with a sickening thud. "Arthur!" Nora picked up her heavy skirts and ran to him. He was struggling to his knees, his breath coming in jagged, ragged gasps. He waved her away frantically with his scarred left hand. "Don't touch me!" he snarled, his voice breaking. "I said, get away from the structure. It isn't safe. A stone could fall. The iron is rusted through." Nora ignored him. She dropped to her knees in the dirt beside him, grabbing his shoulders. He was shaking violently. It wasn't the cold. It was pure, unadulterated trauma. "I'm safe," she said fiercely, locking her eyes onto his. "Look at me. I am safe. I'm right here." Arthur stopped struggling. He looked at her, his chest rising and falling rapidly. He looked past her, toward the blackened skeleton of the conservatory, and a shudder racked his entire body. The anger drained out of him, leaving behind nothing but ruins. "I couldn't get her out," he whispered. The words were torn from his throat, jagged and bleeding. Nora went completely still. She didn't push. She didn't ask who. She simply stayed on her knees in the freezing dirt, her hands firmly anchoring him to the present. Arthur closed his eyes. The dam he had built for 5 years finally broke. "My sister," he said, his voice dropping to a harsh rasp. "Sarah. She was 16. It was her birthday. She wanted to read in the conservatory by candlelight. I was in the library when I smelled the smoke." He opened his eyes, staring at his violently scarred left hand. The dry rot in the walls. It went up like a powder keg. By the time I reached the doors, the iron was melting. The glass was exploding. I could hear her screaming. A tear cut a clean track through the dust on his face, tracing the edge of his burn scars. "I tried to break the iron doors down. I tore my hands apart on the metal. The beams came down. I was pinned. The servants dragged me out." He looked at Nora, his expression shattered. "I listened to her die, Nora. I listened to my little sister burn, and I lived." The silence that followed was suffocating. The wind howled across the moors, whipping Nora's cloak around them. She finally understood. The isolation. The bitter self-loathing. The refusal to engage with a society that whispered about his madness. He wasn't a monster who had lost his mind. He was a brother who couldn't forgive himself for surviving. Nora didn't offer him platitudes. She didn't tell him it wasn't his fault. A man drowning in guilt that deep would only hate her for trying to cheapen it. Instead, she did the only thing that felt real. She stripped off her leather gloves, throwing them into the dirt. With bare, freezing hands, she reached out and gently took his ruined, scarred left hand in hers. Arthur flinched violently, trying to pull away. "Don't. Stop fighting me," she ordered softly, her grip tightening. She looked down at the puckered, shiny skin, the two curled fingers. It was the physical manifestation of his failure, the hand that wasn't strong enough to open a melting door. Slowly, deliberately, Nora brought his scarred hand up to her face and pressed her cheek against his palm. Arthur's breath hitched. He froze entirely. "It is a tragedy, Arthur," Nora whispered, keeping his hand pressed to her skin. "A horrific, unfair tragedy. But it is not a sin. You did not set the fire. You broke your body trying to save her." "I failed," he choked out. "Yes," Nora agreed, her voice steady and grounded. "You failed. Because you are mortal. Because fire is hotter than flesh, and iron is stronger than bone. You failed. But you loved her enough to walk into an inferno. That does not make you a monster. It makes you a man." Arthur stared at her. His hand, trapped against her cheek, was trembling so hard it shook them both. Slowly his thumb moved, brushing awkwardly but tenderly against her jawline. For the first time in 5 years, Arthur Pendleton wasn't looking at the ghosts of his past. He was looking at the woman right in front of him. "Come inside," Nora said softly, finally pulling back and reaching for his cane. "You're freezing." She stood up, offering him her hand. Arthur looked at it for a long moment. Then, gripping his cane with his right hand, he reached out with his left and let his wife pull him up from the dirt. They walked back to the manor in silence, the ruined conservatory standing blindly behind them. The ledger of Oakhaven was not the only thing Nora was beginning to balance. She was beginning to balance him. The moors froze solid in January. Snow swept across Yorkshire in brutal, howling sheets, burying the roads and isolating Oakhaven from the rest of the world. Before the incident at the ruined conservatory, this isolation would have suffocated Nora. Now it felt entirely different. It felt like a fortress. The shift in her marriage was not marked by grand declarations or sudden passionate romance. They were two pragmatic people who had been battered by the world. They did not trust sudden shifts in weather, let alone emotion. Instead, the change manifested in a quiet, steady dismantling of boundaries. Arthur stopped taking his meals in the cavernous dining room. He ordered a small table set up in the library, near the massive stone hearth. The physical distance between them shrank from 30 feet to 3. He also stopped wearing his black gloves indoors. It was a small detail, but the first time he reached across the table to pass the salt, his scarred left hand fully exposed to the firelight, Nora knew exactly what it cost him. She didn't stare. She simply took the shaker and thanked him. They spent their days in the library. Nora commandeered a leather wingback chair for her ledgers and correspondence. Arthur occupied the sofa opposite her, a heavy wool blanket draped over his ruined leg, reading agricultural reports or simply watching the snow bury the window panes. "You are frowning," Arthur observed one afternoon. Nora didn't look up from her ledger. She tapped her quill against the mahogany desk. "I am trying to understand why we are paying the blacksmith in East Witton 3 shillings more per horseshoe than the smith in Middleham." Arthur turned a page in his book. "Because the smith in East Witton has a blind wife and 6 children. He needs the silver more." Nora paused. She looked across the room. Arthur's face was half hidden by the shadows of the fire, but his slate eyes were calm. The sharp, bitter edge that used to coat his every word was gone. "You are running a feudal welfare state, Arthur," she said. though there was no bite in her voice. "I am managing my lands as I see fit," he countered smoothly. He closed his book and set it on the steward table. He leaned his head back, watching her. "You are very good at this, you know. The numbers, the order of it all. You would have made a terrifying solicitor. My Aunt Harriet often told me I lacked the delicate sensibilities required of a lady," Nora said. She looked down at the neat columns of ink. She meant it as an insult. I took it as a survival tactic. Delicate things break easily. Yes, they do." Arthur's gaze drifted to the frosted window, his expression growing distant. But he didn't pull away into the dark place where he used to hide. He stayed tethered to the room. To her. "I am glad you are not delicate, Nora." The quiet intimacy of the moment was shattered by the heavy, echoing thud of the front knocker. Nora flinched. Arthur sat up, his jaw instantly tightening. No one travelled to Oakhaven in the dead of winter. The roads were impassable. A moment later, Mrs. Gable appeared in the library doorway. Her severe face was pinched with extreme disapproval. "Your Grace," she said, addressing Arthur. "Lord Richard Danbury has arrived." Arthur's hand gripped the armrest of the sofa. The knuckles went stark white. "Richard is in London. He's currently tracking mud across the entrance hall, Your Grace." Mrs. Gable corrected flatly. "He claims he was caught in the storm on his way to Scotland and required emergency shelter." "He is lying," Arthur said, his voice dropping into a lethal, quiet register. He grabbed his cane and forced himself upright, wincing as his bad leg took his weight. "Put him in the blue guest room. Tell him I will see him at dinner." When the housekeeper left, Nora stood up. "Who is Lord Richard?" "My cousin," Arthur sneered. He limped toward the door, his previous calm entirely vanished, replaced by the defensive, cornered beast she had met on her first night. "And my heir, until such time as I produce a child of my own." He didn't look at her as he left the room. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind him, leaving Nora alone with the sudden, sharp realization that the safety of their winter fortress had just been breached. Lord Richard Danbury was a man who looked exactly like the sort of aristocrat Aunt Harriet would have sold her soul to court. He was tall, perfectly tailored, and possessed a handsome, entirely untrustworthy face. Nora hated him the moment he walked into the dining room. He moved with an arrogant, loose-limbed grace, eyeing the severe architecture of Oakhaven with thinly veiled contempt. When he saw Nora, his smile widened into something slick and predatory. "Good God!" Richard murmured, taking her hand and bowing over it with exaggerated precision. "The rumours in London did not do you justice, Your Grace. I expected a terrified mouse. Arthur has always had a penchant for collecting broken things." Nora smoothly pulled her hand from his grasp. "And I expected a gentleman, Lord Richard. We are both bound to be disappointed tonight." Richard laughed. It was a sharp, barking sound. He took a seat across from her, crossing his long legs. Arthur did not join them. He had sent word through Mrs. Gable that he was unwell, a lie so transparent it hung in the air like smoke. Nora knew he wasn't sick. He was hiding. He was refusing to let his cousin look at his scars and his limp. The realization made a slow, simmering anger ignite in Nora's chest. "It is a tragedy, really," Richard said, swirling his wineglass as the footman served a thick venison roast. "Arthur used to be the brightest star in the House of Lords. Now look at him, hiding in his rooms like a frightened child. I suppose madness is a heavy burden?" "My husband is not mad," Nora said coldly. She picked up her knife and fork, refusing to let her hands shake. "Oh, come now, Duchess. We are family. There is no need for theatrics." Richard leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. The mocking smile dropped from his face, replaced by a cold, calculating stare. "We both know why you are here. £50,000, a tidy sum to secure a nursemaid for a lunatic. But let us be honest, how long can you tolerate it? The isolation, the gloom, the sheer physical revulsion of looking at him. Nora's grip on her silver knife tightened until the metal bit into her palm. She carefully set her cutlery down. She looked at Richard, her expression completely flat. "You overestimate your charm, Lord Richard, and you vastly underestimate my intelligence," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the room like a razor. Richard raised an eyebrow. "I beg your pardon? You are not here because you were caught in a storm. You are here because you heard Arthur took a wife and you panicked." Nora folded her hands in her lap. She felt no fear. Aunt Harriet had trained her in the art of polite warfare, and Richard Danbury was merely a louder, wealthier version of her aunt. "You have spent the last 5 years waiting for my husband to drink himself to death so you could inherit this estate. Now, there is a threat to your succession. You came to see if the bride was real, and more importantly, if she was pliable." Richard's face darkened. "You speak out of turn, madam." "I am the Duchess of Rotham," Nora replied, her voice ringing off the stone walls. "In this house, I speak precisely when and how I choose." She stood up. The heavy wool of her skirts brushed against the table. "You will leave tomorrow at first light. If you ever return to Oakhaven, or if I hear a single whisper in London concerning my husband's sanity, I will have our solicitors audit the estate's secondary accounts, the ones you've been drawing an unearned allowance from for 3 years. Richard stared at her, genuinely shocked. "You have no proof of that." "I am the one who balances the ledgers, Richard," she said softly. "I know exactly where every penny goes. Good night." She turned and walked toward the double doors. Before she could reach the handle, the doors swung open inward. Arthur stood in the threshold. He was fully dressed in his severe black broadcloth. He wore his gloves. He leaned heavily on his cane, but his posture was completely transformed. He was not slumping. He stood at his full height, his broad shoulders squared, his slate eyes burning with a terrifying, absolute authority. He had heard everything. Arthur looked past Nora, locking his gaze onto his cousin. Richard had gone entirely pale, pushing his chair back with a loud, ugly scrape against the floorboards. "Arthur, I assure you, it was merely a misunderstanding," Richard stammered, his slick arrogance instantly dissolving. "The snow has stopped," Arthur said. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It possessed the density of lead. "Mrs. Gable is having your carriage brought around to the front steps. You will leave now. It is freezing outside. It is the dead of night. You have heavy coats," Arthur replied, stepping aside to clear the doorway. "Do not ever disrespect my wife in my house again. Get out." Richard looked at the Duke, then at Nora. He swallowed hard, the fight draining out of him completely. Without another word, he hurried past Arthur, practically running down the corridor. Nora stood in the dining room, her heart hammering against her ribs. The adrenaline was beginning to fade, leaving her slightly dizzy. Arthur closed the doors. The heavy click of the latch echoed in the silence. He turned to look at her. He didn't move forward. He simply leaned on his cane, studying her with a look of profound, overwhelming disbelief. "You threatened him with an audit," Arthur said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It was effective," Nora managed to say, her breath shallow. "He is a parasite." Arthur took a slow, agonizing step toward her. Then another. He stopped when he was close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him. He reached up with his right hand, his good hand, and gently touched the side of her face. His thumb brushed over her cheekbone. "You fought for me," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a revelation. Nora looked up into his slate eyes. The walls he had built over 5 years were completely gone. There was no bitterness left. There was only the man beneath the scars. "I protect what is mine, Arthur," she said fiercely. Arthur's breath hitched. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. When he opened them, the raw intensity in his gaze made her stomach drop. "Come with me," he murmured. He led her to the east wing, to her rooms. Nora didn't question it. They walked in silence, the only sound the rhythmic thud click of his cane against the floor. When they reached her bedchamber, Arthur followed her inside and closed the door. The fire was already roaring in the hearth, casting a warm golden glow over the heavy crimson velvet of the bed. Arthur stood near the doorway. He looked around the room, as if seeing it for the first time. He set his cane against the wall. £50,000. Arthur said quietly, looking down at his gloved hands. Nora stiffened. The number felt like a splash of cold water. "Why bring that up now?" "Because it is a lie," he answered. He looked up, his eyes locking onto hers. It was the price of a transaction, a contract designed to secure an heir and appease a society that demands a duke fulfill his obligations. But sitting in that hallway tonight, listening to you tear my cousin apart to defend a man who has given you nothing but silence and shadows, I realized something. He took a step toward her. His limp was pronounced without his cane, but he didn't falter. "I would have paid £100,000 for you, Nora. I would have given every acre of this miserable estate just to hear you say the words you said tonight." Nora's breath caught in her throat. "Arthur, I am broken," he interrupted gently, holding up his black-gloved left hand. "I am damaged. I wake up in the middle of the night smelling smoke. I cannot walk without pain. I am not the dashing hero in the romance novels you read in the library. I am a ruin." He reached with his right hand and slowly, deliberately, pulled the black leather glove off his left hand. He dropped it onto the floor. "But I am yours," Arthur said, his voice thick with emotion. "If you want me. The contract dictates you are my wife, but you owe me nothing. I will never force you. I will never demand a single thing you are not willing to give. You have your title. You have your freedom. But if you walk out of this room tonight, understand that you take whatever is left of my heart with you." Nora stared at the scarred, puckered skin of his left hand, illuminated by the firelight. It wasn't ugly to her anymore. It was a map of his survival. It was proof that he had loved his sister enough to burn for her. She didn't run. She didn't freeze. Nora closed the distance between them. She reached out and took his scarred hand, threading her fingers through his crooked ones. He trembled slightly at the contact, but he didn't pull away. "I have spent my entire life being managed, Arthur," Nora whispered, stepping closer until her chest brushed against his waistcoat. "I was an unpaid servant. Then I was a commodity. I have never had a choice in my own destiny until I signed that paper in my aunt's parlour." She reached up with her free hand, resting it against the unscarred side of his neck. His pulse hammered wildly against her palm. "I chose to sign the ledger," she said, her voice fiercely tender. "I chose to sit with you in the dirt by the conservatory, and I am choosing you now. Not the Duke, not the £50,000, just you." Arthur let out a ragged breath. He dropped his head, resting his forehead against hers. "Nora." He whispered her name. Like a prayer he had finally been allowed to say aloud. He wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her flush against him. His kiss was not desperate or demanding. It was profound, grounded, and intensely careful, as if he believed she might still shatter. But Nora kissed him back with all the fierce, unyielding strength that had kept her alive in Aunt Harriet's house. She anchored her hands in his thick, silver-streaked hair, pulling him closer, erasing the last of the physical distance between them. The transaction was over. The marriage had finally begun. Spring arrived late to the Yorkshire moors, but when it came, it broke the frozen earth with violent, sudden green. The air was sharp and sweet on the morning Nora stood at the edge of the south lawn. She wore a simple blue muslin dress, entirely lacking the heavy velvet and silk of her winter wardrobe. Beside her, leaning on his ebony cane, stood Arthur. Before them, a small army of stonemasons and labourers were pulling down the last blackened iron beams of the ruined conservatory. The shattering of glass and the shouts of the workmen filled the air, a chaotic symphony of destruction. Arthur watched a heavy stone pillar topple, crashing into the dirt and raising a cloud of ash and dust. His jaw was relaxed. His left hand, bare in the sunlight, rested lightly on Nora's shoulder. "It looks empty," Arthur remarked quietly. "It looks clear," Nora corrected. She leaned into his touch. "What will you put there? You cannot leave a massive patch of dirt against the south wing. I was thinking of an orchard." Arthur mused, his thumb tracing a slow circle on her collarbone. "Apple trees, plum, something that actually requires the dirt, something that grows." Nora smiled, looking out at the ruined earth that was slowly being leveled. "I think that is a highly practical investment, Your Grace," Arthur chuckled, a warm, rich sound that seemed to carry over the noise of the workmen. He turned his head and pressed a kiss into the crown of her hair. "We are very good at investments, my love," he murmured. Nora watched the last piece of iron dragged away. She didn't know what the future held. There would be dark days, she knew. Arthur would still have nightmares. She would still have moments of cynical detachment. They were not miraculously cured by love. But as they stood together in the morning sun, watching the ghosts of the past finally being cleared away to make room for something new, Nora knew one thing with absolute certainty. Aunt Harriet had sold her for £50,000, but what Nora had bought was priceless. If you enjoyed this story of healing, resilience, and a love that defied all odds, please take a moment to leave a like and share it with someone who loves a truly grounded historical romance. Your support helps me bring more original, deeply human stories to life. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss a new video. Let me know in the comments below. What was your favorite moment between Nora and Arthur? See you in the next story.